welcome everyone to the Ortho Real podcast. We are delighted today to have somebody very special with us. It gets no more ortho and no more real than Dr. Leo Whiteside. He has been involved in design and development of hip and knee arthroplasty for decades. Obviously one of the thought leaders and the giants in our community, really an icon. We're also joined by Kevin Brown of Device Nation, who's going to help us with podcasting and with questions and making this a real interview. We're talking and focusing a little bit on history of joint replacement implants, particularly of the knee and hip, trying to get some of these things down before they're lost to history or not recorded somehow. Dr. Whiteside, thanks so much for joining us.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. Thanks for having the opportunity to talk about something that's extremely important in health, becoming even more important.
Kevin, welcome.
Thank you, sir. It's an honor to be on the show with both of you.
Dr. Whiteside, I think as we look back to the 19th century, there were a lot of attempts at some various interposition arthroplasties. In the early 20th century, the Judet brothers, Dr. Smith-Peterson, some others, did some ceramic and glass and bakelite type femoral head hemiarthroplasties. But in the modern era, I think at least of maybe 1950s and onward, where we really started to get some of the predecessors of our more modern implants in the knee and hip. Think about Austin Moore for hip, Thompson for hip, and then some of the early knee designs. What can you tell us about the history of these joint replacement implants, or where you see it kind of starting for hip and knee in a more modern context?
Well, I think most people point to John Charnley's efforts to cement the hip in as the beginning of the modern era of arthroplasty. But I'll tell you something. I think the cemented total hip was a huge misstep. The Ling hip and McKee Farrar and others were making some real headway with cementless fixation of metal to bone with bone ingrowth back in the 1950s and 60s. And cement sort of blew all that away. It for one thing, it was a huge marketing effort. And John Charnley was one of the best marketers in the history of medicine. People found it very easy to get on board with that guy. And he had the entire British Isles behind this effort, too. Most people don't realize what an effort it was to get him to Wrightington, to get him up and rolling, and all of the facilities in place to generate this cemented hip movement. And then, of course, it went directly into cemented total knee, and it took us decades to get away from cemented total hip. And it wasn't just by accident that we got away from cemented total hip, despite all the facts that and all of the papers that were coming out from people with a huge vested interest saying that cement was just fine, in fact, superior to cementless. The practitioners went to cementless anyway because they were tired of dealing with the complications of cement in total hip arthroplasty. And one of the things that era that we kind of weren't ready for. And as a young practicing orthopedic surgeon, I saw cement get up and take off, and I was just loath to pack bones full of cement. But that's what we had. But I'll tell you what, it gave me a real incentive to get in the laboratory and get into the literature and to do everything I could to get cementless hip, and then as soon as I could get my hands on it, cementless knee up and rolling.
That's fascinating to hear from that context. I think from my perspective, at least the narrative that comes about maybe and is adopted or heard by younger surgeons is that that Charnley was sort of an outcast, that there was this real pushback against the idea of arthroplasty in general because of some of the complications associated with it. And you certainly hear about Ring and McKee-Farrar, and I believe the Urist and some of those other early designs being associated more with the metal-on-metal articulations. Do you think they had maybe better fixation options in terms of the cementless options available with that, but maybe they were a little behind the eight ball in terms of having that hard-on-hard bearing surface?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes, you said a couple of things I think that are really apropos, and I think that's the next feature to address is the bearing surface itself. And also, you mentioned that Charnley was an outcast and had to prove his point to a skeptical, non-receptive audience. And you know that's so true of anybody who does anything innovative, whether it's good or bad. You have to fight that established opinion. That's always, and most of us who have been involved in development realize that the future is what's really real, and the present really isn't. And if you believe what 90% of people believe, you're wrong. And that Charnley faced that, and I have, and almost anybody else who's had an innovative approach to anything in science and technology has found that they found something that's true and real, and still the establishment is believing something that is wrong to the person who has stepped out away from the fog. So you're right about Charnley. He was, to a certain extent, a maverick. He was a sort of a mechanical engineer sort of guy, and he wasn't afraid to take on a new idea. The guy was fearless, absolutely fearless, in terms of the bearing surface as well. You mentioned the bearing surface, and you know Charnley's original bearing surface was stainless steel against Teflon, and I'm telling you, he ruined hundreds of hips before he realized what was happening. Then he had to take them all out and clean up that god-awful mess.
Wow.
And then, of course, about the same time was metal on metal. In fact, metal on metal preceded the so-called low-friction arthroplasty that Charnley was so intent on developing. But he you know, this guy was persistent, and he went from Teflon to high-density polyethylene, and then finally ultra-high molecular weight polyethylene. And then that innovation was what saved arthroplasty, because metal on metal back in the 70s, early 70s, was falling apart. I mean, ruining people, and the literature was full of it about what are we going to do about these huge cysts that are developing around these metal on metal hips, and also the high loosening rate. And then Charnley's low friction arthroplasty made it metal on polyethylene, which was way better than metal on metal. It's amazing that we have forgotten, that the community forgot about that track of metal on metal in the early 1970s up to the mid 1970s. And so here I was, an established orthopedic surgeon, watching everybody doing metal on metal again. Marketing was huge, and I called my fellows and ex-residents up and said, don't do this. And patients come in asking for it, and if I don't do it, somebody else will. And then, as the time went on, I got more and more calls about those guys saying, I should have listened.
You have touched on just a couple of profound points there, and I think just sort of the renegades that really develop any of these disruptive technologies in any field are so important, and it's a bit different and it's a bit tough as far as how we integrate some of those things in medicine, because we are in fact affecting our patients' lives in a very real way, and what's acceptable in terms of risk to all of it. And I think we could probably jump off for hours on that. And then your points on metal on metal. Certainly a contemporary and colleague of yours, Dr. Tony Headley, was my professional mentor and warned me when I was a fellow, as metal on metal was still making its rounds, that this was a bad deal, and when the lawyers get hold of it, look out. So when I started seeing the commercials for it years later, it just all came back to me. It was so prophetic on that, and it sounds like you were with your fellows as well.
Yes. Yeah, I'm so proud of Tony for taking that stand as well. He and I were among the real minority surgeons who refused to get involved in that metal on metal. A lot of good guys, otherwise wise heads, fell for that. And you know something, where we still got other things like that going on, and that need to be solved.
I want to talk about some of those, but if we go back, and this is obviously a broad question as well, if you think about hips and you think about knees in a modern context, let's say from mid-1960s on, what do you see as the most important designs, either in terms of a particular device or a particular brand, or just a particular concept? And who were the really innovative thought leaders, if you will, that were behind those? What do you see as the key points?
John Hensall was, to my way of thinking, such a giant in arthroplasty. Very solid, sensible designs, and Al Burstein, the mechanical engineer. The two of those guys working together developed an articular surface for total knee that still ought to be used on everybody. Single radius of curvature on the femur and in the coronal plane, and single radius of curvature on the tibial polyethylene, and stick with that. But we've had all these strange flat surfaces and other screwball surfaces that just do not hold up to just basic, decent bearing design. So those two guys, and the other thing about John Hensall was ligament releases to balance the knee. He wrote a beautiful article in Journal of Bone and Joint Surgery in the 70s that really did tell you, here's the way you release the medial side, and here's the way you release the lateral side. Some beautiful classic drawings, and it still holds up. We all found out early in total knee replacement that if you got your choice of leaving them crooked or not doing them. I mean, we didn't have any way to release ligaments, so we take this terrible varus knee or valgus knee and do it in situ. Didn't really correct deformity, didn't really correct ligaments. And if you tried to correct deformity without correcting ligaments, as I started thinking about, you ended up with a floppy mess. And then they started developing these hinge arthroplasties and to try to solve the ligament balancing problem. And John Hensall was really a great leader in how to get that balanced and aligned. And it's such an important concept. Another really key figure in cementless fixation in the hip, seldom mentioned, is Emmett Lunsford. I don't know if you heard much about him, Matt, but Emmett Lunsford was the father of the AML hip. He's the one that actually coined the term Austin Moore Lunsford, because it came after the Austin Moore femoral complex, called AML hip. And he said, force coat this thing, and I almost started putting them in. And he really made that work. And then Charlie Ng got on board with him, and then Emmett died in a plane crash, very sad situation, right as he was really catching on fire. But Charlie Ng did a good job picking that torch up and running with it.
Yes,
and those two guys are really important in cementless fixation and total hip.
Certainly, Dr. Ng's name is the one I think of as being associated with that. And I actually, while
Sure.
I believe I've heard Lunsford's name, I thought of AML as anatomic medullary locking.
That's right.
Yes. And so I did not know that other story or that other connection. That's pretty fascinating.
Yeah, and there's an interesting legal issue behind that as well. You know, it was called the AML, Austin Moore Lunsford, and then they wanted to get away from names for a couple of reasons. Emmett Lunsford was a little bit difficult to deal with every now and then, and they wanted other people on board with it, and they didn't want to be marketing the Lunsford hip, so they started calling it the Austin, the anatomic medullary locking, so they wouldn't have to change it away from AML that people were really picking up on. And then when Emmett died in that airplane crash, his royalties, which were huge at that time, were diverted from his wife to the other camp of
Wow.
AML developers, Charlie Ng and those guys. And there was a great legal battle about who actually owned the rights to the AML hip. And the fact that it was called the AML Lunsford and they had it as well documented made it easier on Emmett's family.
That's fascinating. I think that's probably a story or a part of this that you're not going to see in print a lot of places, that comes from your very unique knowledge.
Not likely to.
So obviously, as you mentioned, Dr. Insall, along with Bernstein, a huge contribution in the knee space. At least looking at it from this end of history, you sort of think back to that time, and that there was that New York camp, if you will, with Dr. Insall and posterior cruciate sacrificing designs. We had some others out there doing a lot of work around cruciate retaining designs. Dr. Krakow, Hungerford, Headley, and others with PCA. You've obviously talked a lot about ligament balancing. For anybody listening, you've got some great content over on ViewMedi with some cadaveric dissections and some other talk about that. But other big camps around particular thought processes or designs that you think were important in that space?
Well, I think you did mention David Hungerford. Hungerford was a really important figure with alignment. You know, he had developed that extramedullary alignment system with Helmetica about the same time that I was developing an intramedullary alignment system with Dow Corning Wright. And so he and I locked horns all the time about whether you should go intramedullary or extramedullary. But then we would put together a group of surgeons, and we'd have 100 people in the room doing cadaver total knee, and we'd have, with intramedullary alignment, we'd have none of them put in crooked, none. And with with the extramedullary, just down the hallway, they would have 30% of those guys with a really crooked looking knee, even with a skinned out cadaver bone. You know, the days of doing cadaver labs is definitely over. Maybe not over, but certainly curtailed. We used to get in the plane with boxes of cadaver bones in our checked luggage, and a bunch of them in our carry-on luggage as well.
Wow.
We'd go to Omaha or somewhere and do and check into a hotel and get their conference room and do a cadaver lab. with the guys there locally. So that's the way we taught each other how to do arthroplasty surgery. I want to tell you, the restrictions on that sort of thing are huge.
It was a
Can't
different
even
time
come
for
close to
sure.
doing that kind of thing.
So
You mentioned Ken Krakow, and I really love some of the work that Ken did too with alignment of the knee, and those guys were involved in the PCA knee. Now remember, the PCA was a big failure in cementless fixation, and it was because of inadequate fixation. And inadequate fixation of the tibial component especially. There were getting where you could kind of get the femur, but the tibia was fixed with those two little angled pegs. And what made a difference was adequate fixation of the tibial component. Another guy that seldom mentioned is Bob Bolts. Bob was an engineer, orthopedic surgeon, and his engineering concepts were simple. Like, if it's not fixed with a peg, use screws too. And he put the screws in the tibial component and solved the problem of fixation of that. And I've taken that and run with it all my life. The way to get that tibia fixed down to bone is with the stem and screws. And so that was Bob Bolts' work to first demonstrate how effective that is in cadaver bone with repetitive loading. But unfortunately, those guys that were involved in that AMK knee was supposed to be the knee version of the AML hip. AMK knee had the crummiest locking mechanism for the polyethylene to the metal tray of anything I've ever seen. It was just as rickety as any piece of junk that you could find in Walmart. I mean, you put that polyethylene in, you can put it in with your hand, or it might be, I think theirs was put in and held with a little clip. So you slide it in by hand, and then you slip a clip in there and tap it in. Wiggled immediately. And so here you are, this polyethylene against this metal surface underneath that did nothing but just wear away and get loose and pump up and down and fill those screw holes full of cement debris and joint fluid. So although it was a great partial concept, they didn't finish off by locking and sealing the polyethylene into the metal. And, that's another thing that has developed with time. Good engineering is not what we started out with. It's crummy engineering. I mean, polyethylene components that were in the hip that were held in with a metal ring and not press fit and locked and sealed into the metal shell. So here you have this loose polyethylene that passes the FDA wedge out test, but obviously fills the hip joint full of polyethylene debris. And we're still kind of cleaning up the messes from that era. It's amazing that if you think these basic simple things that make arthroplasty work had to be learned the hard way. That's one of the things I started working on early, is putting the polyethylene component in and driving it in solidly fixed, captured peripherally with a sealing rim. Now that I started with Dow Corning Wright, and then with Smith and Nephew, we really picked that up and made that happen. And the current knee that I'm working on focuses on that. And now I look at new designs, and more the designs are coming up to speed. But look at how long it's taken us to learn to fix the polyethylene bearing surface firmly down to the metal.
Conceptually, I think this sort of
interface.
Sorry. Conceptually, I think that sort of circles back even to what you were talking about a little bit with Charnley, where there was, the bearing surface was better, and maybe the fixation was not what it should have been with cement. So we sort of had one part of the design that was was a step forward or was really good, and it was held back by another portion of it. And I think probably anything is susceptible to that. From the hip side, I think you've been involved in sort of a quadrilock type stem. What do you see as key design features in terms of stem design and cup design and things like that on the hip side? What have been the major steps, and what have been your major steps?
You know, it's so important in the femoral stem and total hip replacement to achieve torsional fixation. It's pretty much got to be a stem. I think we've not given up on attempting to resurface the femoral head, and most people have accepted taking off the femoral head and stem down the medullary canal, and that's definitely changing the function of the surface structures in that device, the bone that is. So you got this stem that goes down the center of the medullary canal, where there's not hard bone, it's soft bone, and you have to find a way to get axillary and torsional fixation. And if you get a cadaver bone and drive an implant in tightly and do axial loading, not really a problem. And with or without a collar, if you do a pretty decent broaching job, you can get it axially fixed. But torsional fixation up to the loads that are actually applied in real life, difficult to do. So that I think is one of the things you really have to look for is torsional fixation. So one of the first guys to get on torsional fixation with a rectangular stem was Spymuller. That's another name that's a great name in orthopedics that is slowly disappearing. Spymuller hip, the rectangular design, so simple and so effective. He actually used a grit blasted surface rather than an effective porous coating. And I think if he'd had an effective porous coating to work with, his technology would have really taken off. But unfortunately, he didn't have that porous surface. He just used a coarse grit blast. What I found looking at cadaver bones, if you put a rectangular stem in and make sure you design it and broach for it so it gets fixed into the diaphyseal cortical bone and supported by a significant amount of the femoral neck, then that implant is hard to put in wrong. I mean, it's gonna work, and I'm talking about hundreds in a row without a single case of loosening. But it all, one of these things where several things which are not perfectly intuitively obvious have to be done well. And I think we're pretty good with that, except I still see a lot of stems that don't work hard enough to get the initial torsional fixation of the femoral component.
I think you've got a couple of great points there. I've implanted a couple of Zweimuller type designs, actually not in this country, but doing some mission work where that was our available implant, and they did quite well. And I think your point about torsional stability is key too, and something that may be, I don't know, I feel like we're getting that revisited a little bit. There have been some reports actually tied to direct anterior approach hips, probably because those surgical approaches sort of mandate the use of a shorter, often curved stem, where you're seeing a lot of medial lateral wedge taper designs, and there is a little, not a huge, but a higher than expected rate of stem loosening reported in some of those. And I think that speaks maybe to what's being implanted and how they're being implanted in that situation, and not having that immediate torsional stability.
Well, you're exactly right, Matt. If you can't get adequate exposure and a straight down shot at the femoral canal, you have to accept a shorter stem and so you have to sacrifice that diaphyseal, hard cortical bone engagement. And so you're never going to get beyond that deficiency. You're going to have some loosening with stems like that. And if you don't get your loosening down to 1 in 1,000, then you've got to go straight down the stem and get the diaphyseal cortex involved in torsional fixation. Again, looking at cadaver specimens, putting in a stem with or without actual cortical engagement in the diaphyseal portion of the bone, the upper diaphyseal portion of the bone, but without that at least in engagement, you sacrifice 25% of your load-bearing capacity with immediate loading. That's a lot. If you save a little bit extra neck, that adds some more as well. If you do both, save some neck and engage the diaphyseal cortical bone, then torsional fixation is going to be good. It's kind of hard to screw it up. But if you cut a lot of the neck off to get exposure of the femur because of limited approach, and if you use a short curved stem, I think you got to have a lot of luck to not have a lot of looseness.
Well, obviously those stems can do well, but certainly we do have very different bone. I mean, between some patients with door A versus door C bone and everything in between, and how, some of those patients may need a different type of stem, and that may be limited sometimes depending on surgical exposure. Kevin Brown, jump in here. What have you got for Dr. Whiteside about the history of knee and hip implants, coming from having sold a few of these things over the years?
Great stuff, Dr. Whiteside. I've really enjoyed just listening to this trip down the corridors of joint replacement. One question I had a surgeon tell me if I had to have one stem on a deserted island, I only had access to one, it would be a Wagner because of the ability to tweak version and pretty consistent engagement. And I was just wondering, what would your answer be to that question? If you were on a deserted island and you were only entitled to one stem, which one would it be?
And I can have any one that I want.
That's right.
After having used a bunch of them, I would choose, of course, the one that I developed myself. But I'm going to exclude that because it's not a fair question, not a fair answer to a fair question. And if I had one other than that, I'd taper lock. Taper lock. Mm-hmm. You can broach for that guy, and the taper lock that's kind of highly developed device. I think it's now offered Zimmer Biomet. That guy will give you rigid fixation. It gets you down to the diaphyseal cortical bone and leaves enough neck that it's effective proximally as well. And you can put it in with minimal tools.
I read a great article the other day detailing Austin Moore and how he developed that prosthesis. And I love the punchline of the story where it showed him having proudly welded that implant to the hood of his 1951 Chrysler. And I'm just curious if there was one implant, as we've talked about the corridors of history, if there was one implant that you would weld to the hood of your car, which one would that be?
Well, I don't know. It might well be that, or the total convolular knee femoral component.
Right. So we've talked a lot about implants. We've talked about the shapes and all these things. I want to talk just a minute about approaches, because we've certainly seen that transition over the years: posterior lateral, 2 incisions, superior, direct anterior. Where are we now on that evolution of how we put those things in, and where do you think the dust is going to eventually settle?
I can tell you unequivocally where we ought to be. Not where we are, but where we ought to be. Posterior approach. Absolutely should do posterior approach for a total hip replacement and forget about the rest of them. never split the abductor muscle group. Never split that group of muscles to get down the medullary canal of the femur. It's destructive to many patients. It's hard to get people to admit it, and the British Isles are totally dedicated to various of these abductor muscle splitting approaches that they've named for various British surgeons. I just think that's crazy. And anterior, you just can't get enough exposure, and you get into a tight situation, and you end up dissecting the abductors off in order to elevate the femur enough to work on it. Posterior approach. You can take the femoral head off early in a very tight hip to get in. You can release the gluteus maximus tendon to get you more exposure to raise that up, and you can get right down the medullary canal in the toughest of hips, get a good effective implant in without damaging the abductors. The abductors are just not considered enough. So we're still working through marketing and just medical mainstream bull, and going through these strange, and that leads me into these super pass approaches and superior approaches where you go in and you put a retractor right into that abductor mechanism and blow it, just in order to make a smaller incision. I hope to live long enough to see people wake up to the foolishness of tearing up the abductors in order to do a total hip, when you can do a posterior approach and get it absolutely right.
Dr. Whiteside, when I think of the Mount Rushmore of joint reconstruction, I see your face on there, and I see it for one reason, your development of intramedullary knee instruments, which I think was pivotal to getting these things put in correctly. I'd love to know about that association with Dow Corning Wright and how you came up with that idea.
Well, I was just coming out of residency when I started working intramedullary alignment, because I was struggling with using the standard total condylar knee instruments. So in my garage, I took a steel rod, bent it to a 5-degree angle, and put some pins on it, welded some pins on it, and then I started using that in the operating room. Not the kind of thing you could do nowadays, but because somebody, the head nurse, would be on right down there, and you'd be in front of a committee in no time. But that's what I had to work with, so I started putting total condylar knees in with the distal femoral cut made by that incision. And looking, then I became chairman of the orthopedic department, and I was looking for some backing to get this up and running. Had no idea how that would work, and one of the sales guys who was just kind of getting up and running with Dow Corning Wright said, I know exactly who you ought to talk to. So back in those days, the developing surgeon would go to the president of the company, and you sit down and talk and make a decision. And that's what we did. And we came up with the OrthoLock instrumentation system, made pretty much the way I made that first one in the operating room. I mean, in my garage. And I also made one to go right down the center of the tibia. That was straight. And then I found that I actually wanted to bend that one back 4 degrees. And so we ended up with a 4-degree posterior slope on the tibia. The intramedullary alignment rod was kept by Dow Corning Wright on the femur and tibia both. A lot of the other companies got onto it quickly and developed intramedullary instrumentation for the femur, and they've ignored how easy and important it is to use an intramedullary rod in the tibia as well. I still do. I use intramedullary alignment in the tibia, except in uni knees. Of course, use extramedullary in the uni, but intramedullary in the tibia. It was interesting to see the other companies try to compete with an intramedullary rod, not even close. And the surgeons could see it, and that gave Dow Corning a big advantage in the marketplace, and they really went through an interesting growth phase. But what changed it was the rest of the companies found a way to work around the intellectual property and get their own version of the intramedullary alignment system.
Dr. Whiteside, I'll never forget calling on a surgeon, and he had a model in his office, and it was the craziest thing I'd ever seen. It looked like a carnival ride in your knee, and it was the first mobile bearing. It had 2 meniscal bearings in it, which I don't think that design is around anymore. It's gone to a central pivot, but I'd love to get your opinion on Pappas and I believe Beagle. Their work in the 70s on the LCS. At the time, it was the New Jersey knee, and what you think about it?
Well, it seemed like a good idea at the time. That's one of those things where, it seemed like a great idea to make a great big bearing surface on the femur to articulate the polyethylene to the femoral component. Great big old bearing surface that was tightly fit, and then another big bearing surface underneath it that would rotate. And so it just seemed like such a good idea, and it looked like it to me too. And then everybody else tried to copy it. But then if you looked at the wear data from that, it turns out in the knee, the bigger the surface area, the higher the volumetric wear. And you got 2 of them. I just remember the wear studies that finally started coming out showing that is such a bad idea in terms of volumetric polyethylene wear. And then we found complications with rotational dislocation of the bearing and that kind of thing. And so while everybody was getting excited and up and running and getting their own version as the patent ran out, that's when we began to realize, hey, this is having a higher failure rate, higher wear rate, no matter what we do. And the idea is pretty well gone now, don't you think? I mean, I have seen, you see a mobile bearing still in revision knees, revision hinges, and things like that. But I don't think a mobile bearing has any place in total knee arthroplasty.
Doctor, you started out this conversation talking about the changes that are being made, and not all of them are good. I remember a concept in business school of the diminishing marginal returns curve, and I'm wondering if that's where we are right now in implant design. Are we as good as we're going to get with metal and plastic, or you think there's still some room for improvement?
Well, I don't see a lot of room for improvement in the articular surface design. Look at all the things that have been tried. Custom implants and all of this business with the custom implant designed from an MRI or a CT scan. It's just gotten us nowhere. But the one big thing where we got to go, in my opinion, where we got to go is ceramic femoral component in total knee. Now, if you look at a total knee femoral component over the years, it scuffs up and sheds significant amount of metal, and it's not going to ever stop. Cobalt chromium sliding on polyethylene releases significant amount of metal or debris, much more than a femoral head against a polyethylene component in a total hip. And you note that we've gotten away from cobalt chrome femoral heads in the hip, but we're still using this cobalt chromium femoral component in total knee. I've been told by one of my friends who works with J&J that the European version of the FDA has come out with labeling requirements now for total knee replacement that label the cobalt chromium femoral component as potentially carcinogenic, which it is. So we got to get away from that. And that's one of my major focuses right now is to develop a ceramic cementless porous coated femoral component for the knee. With that, I think we'll take a step forward.
Dr. Whiteside, you've talked around this a little bit in some of our questions and hit on points of it. In terms of the implants themselves and what's being done and what's being designed right now, where are we going wrong? Are there mistakes that are being repeated or designs that you just think they just don't have legs, they're not going to go? What's out there that we're doing wrong?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what, not fixing the polyethylene well enough is a big issue. I still see these things coming out with polyethylene, lock the metal where it will leak down through screw holes, loosen up, come loose, and simple as that engineering concept is, I think the manufacturing is somewhat more difficult, but that's got to be done awfully well. I don't think it's being done very well right now. I think fiddling around with minimally invasive approaches in order to fool the public is a big mistake. I don't think we should attempt to market incision length and make any sacrifices at all in terms of quality of patient's end result.
That's an interesting concept.
You know, it's something we're still learning something about locking devices with a taper, aren't we? Still coming out with goofy tapers that are too small, not well enough designed. I think this. It's tempting, isn't it, to come out with something else that is mechanically unsound in the long term. And I'm sure we're going to find some more things that are not so happy. You know, you mentioned the posterior stabilized knee. That was one of Insol's, I think, mistakes, was to develop that posterior stabilized knee, take out the posterior cruciate ligament, and then substitute it with a plastic post. The studies that are coming out now, especially that big Australian study, show that the complication rate with these posterior stabilized knees over a 10-year period of time is significantly higher, and some catastrophic complication rates. You know, we're still another one, a separate issue. We're still messing up the femoral surface of the patellofemoral articulation, designing it for a plastic component that can never be fixed well enough to the femur, and not designing it well enough to be patella friendly, so that the native patella is perfectly comfortable against that bearing surface.
Certainly touching on some controversial issues there with PS versus CR and with patellar resurfacing or non-resurfacing. It is an interesting point about cam post impingement and some of the other issues that come up with those designs. And I certainly do sort of have this feel or this thought that we're getting a resurgent interest in medial pivot and ultra congruent designs where the posterior cruciate ligament is maintained or not maintained, but we're using something besides a cam and post to stabilize that anterior to posterior translation. I know you use an ultra congruent in one of your designs for your knee as well.
Yeah. I think that's a good point. Ultra congruent and also medial pivot, sort of similar situation. And I find the medial pivot interesting, and it does require sacrifice of the PCL in a lot of cases, but I think it makes some sense to give your knee some AP stability, because the PCL is often compromised in a total knee and the ACL pretty much always taken out. So
I agree.
I think that kind of highly conforming is very helpful when you need it, but I don't think we have to make a knee replacement that has to be medial pivot. I wouldn't want to have to always use that medial pivot component and make the ligaments adjust to it. I'll tell you one thing I wish we could do and do well would be a modular knee system where if you put in a unicompartmental knee and they developed patellofemoral disease later, you could put in a patellofemoral as another relatively minor procedure, and then if the lateral component or compartment went down, add a lateral component to it. You know, that's what Philippe Cartier did. I don't know if you know Philippe Cartier, but he's the great uni knee guy, and that's kind of exactly what he did. For one thing, he told them that the patellofemoral didn't make any difference. And if he put in a medial uni and they wore out the lateral side of his knee, he put in a lateral uni, and he did that consistently. And I don't know if he's still alive, but he went at least into his retirement saying that is absolutely the way to go. And if you go into his clinic and look at his knee patients, it's pretty convincing. So I think it'd be nice to have a progressive modular system. So if you didn't fail, if your uni failed due to lateral or compartment disease, you feel good about going in and doing a lateral uni. I think most people in the U.S. would feel kind of squeamish about doing that. I have done that. As a matter of fact, I just don't see very many of them to do. But I've done a medial uni and had them develop lateral disease and gone back and done a lateral uni on that knee. And there's a good ACL, good PCL, and a relatively minor procedure, and they're off and running again.
Doc, I can't thank you enough for your contributions to the field and to the development and design, and also for talking to us today about the history of some of this. I greatly appreciate you spending the time with us, and certainly if you've got anything else to add, feel free to drop it in here.
Well, I feel it a great privilege to be asked to speak with you guys, and it's and thanks very much for letting me ramble on about these things. Sometimes I forget how much I've forgotten. But it's good to be reminded every now and then. And it's also interesting to have the opportunity to try to peer into the future again and discuss making those tentative steps that you have to make if you're going to risk your reputation and livelihood on trying to get involved with the next step.
I think that window into the past helps us a lot as far as figuring out the future here. So thanks so much for all of this, and I greatly appreciate your time. Thanks, Kevin, as well, for joining us. It's been great, guys.
Thank you. It's an honor and a pleasure.
Thanks so much for joining us for this episode of the Ortho Real podcast. An absolute pleasure to spend some time with Dr. Leo Whiteside, one of the icons in our field. Certainly a lot of inside information there that would be lost to history if we didn't have the chance to share this conversation. Many thanks to Kevin Brown of Device Nation. If you don't subscribe to Device Nation podcast already, go ahead and do that. Kevin has got a lot of awesome content on there, some talks with some really fantastic surgeons, people in the medical device industry, great people to hear from. Check that out. Thanks so much for tuning in. Check us out next time. Ortho Real.